welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 55. The Hunters of Men. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the reign of Muhammad, the son of Emir Ghazi, the king of the north. We ended with his death and the emergence of Mesud as the preeminent Turkish potentate. And today, we will discuss how Mesud would become not just the leading Turkish potentate, but indeed conquer Anatolia. And we will also see a new emperor don the purple in Constantinople, and a new invader set sail in the west. Now to begin, we need to visit Konya, to see what kind of state the Sultanate of Rum was at this point, as it embarks on the next chapter of its history. Indeed, in some ways, all of the history of the Sultanate up to this period has been merely a prehistory of a sort. The reigns of Suleiman and Ebul Qasim and Kılıç Arslan, while they established the state and laid its foundations, did not ultimately really create the state that emerged in the mid-12th century and that would go on to rule Anatolia for over a century until the coming of the Mongols, with the dynasty itself continuing even further under Mongol overlordship. Indeed, many modern historians caution against taking our sources too seriously or too literally regarding the early years of the Sultanate, that is really anything before Mesud's rule. Our later authors are all writing with the foreknowledge that they have that the Sultanate is going to survive and become the greatest state in Anatolia. So when writing about the early years of the dynasty of Kutalmış, they are projecting back into the past their understanding of the Sultanate in the present in which they were writing. Now, some of these things we've already mentioned, of course. The importance of the ideology of jihad to the regime's legitimacy, the centralized nature of the state, and the unquestioned supremacy of the line of Kutalmış among the Turks of Anatolia. As we have already seen in the course of the podcast, none of these things were constant or certain in the early years of the Sultanate. But we have seen the building blocks, the beginnings of each of these themes. None of them were invented out of whole cloth or came from nowhere. We saw how the legitimacy of the House of Seljuk in the eyes of the Turks provided both Suleiman and Kılıç Arslan with an immense advantage in their struggles for power, even if that was far from supreme overlordship or total power. And Mesud, remember, started his reign as a vassal of a Danishmend Bey. But even here, in truth, we saw the immense prestige of the House of Seljuk and its importance to his lord and father-in-law. We also saw the ideology of jihad, the Ghazi ideology, begin to emerge as a key part of the legitimacy of the Sultanate and the other beyliks during the reign of Kılıç Arslan, a response to the invasion of the Crusaders and the Byzantines, as the Turkish rulers began to conceive of themselves as holy warriors of the faith. And we of course saw the foundations of the centralized state that would be born in Anatolia, the layering of Perso-Islamic and Turkish structures of government on top of the pre-existing Roman state infrastructure, as the Turks stepped into the role formerly played by the Roman soldiers and mercenaries. How this began a melding of Turkish, Perso-Islamic, and Roman modes and even ideologies of government. But now, under the reign of Mesud, all of these things, the centrality of the Ghazi ideology, a centralized state, and the supremacy of the line of Kutalmış, are all going to weave together and mature. The reign of Mesud will see the Sultanate of Rum come into its own and become the state that will go on to conquer and rule Turkish Anatolia. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because now, in 1142, the power of the Sultan of Rum was really still potential power. Upon the death of Muhammad, the king of the north, Mesud instantly became the most powerful and prominent Turkish potentate in Anatolia, but he did not become the overlord of the other beys. That would take work and indeed war. So what did the Sultanate look like in 1142? What was this base that Mesud would build from? Well, to start with, the territory directly controlled by the Sultanate was probably not very large when compared to its prior heights. According to the Byzantine sources, Mesud had been leading invasions of Byzantine territories to the south and the west during the mid to late 1130s, that is, after making his alliance with Muhammad, while the king of the north was still the overlord of most of Turkish Anatolia. Choniates tells us that while Emperor John had been campaigning in the Levant in 1137 and 1138, Iconian had taken advantage of the opportunity to launch attacks against the Romans. Furthermore, based on comments by Choniates and John Kinamos in their description of the imperial campaign to Beyşehir Gölü, it appears that the Christians and the Turks of this land were also ruled by the Sultan, or at least by his vassals. We also know from references by Ibn al-Qalanisi and Ibn al-Athir that Mesud was the lord of Aksaray, which lies to the northeast of Konya. Taken all together, then, it seems that the territory directly ruled by the Sultanate now constituted a roughly ovoid patch of south-central Anatolia, centered on Konya and the pocket of grassland surrounding the city. In the west, this territory ended in the mountains and the great upland lakes of Beyşehir Gölü and Ereğli Gölü, inland from Antalya. In the north, its frontier was roughly a line running from Bolvadin in the west to the Great Salt Lake of Tuz Gölü in the east, encompassing both Akşehir in the west and Aksaray in the east. In the east, the power of the Sultanate likely ended where the hills and the alien rocky landscape of Cappadocia began, with Nevşehir and Kayseri definitively outside of the reach of the Sultan. And in the south, the great Taurus Mountains rising up from the Mediterranean Sea formed a natural border with the Byzantine-held coasts and the lands of the Armenian Principality of Cilicia. In short, a substantial chunk of south-central Anatolia, but a far cry from rulership of the whole peninsula. The days of Kılıç Arslan, when the Roman Sultan was the overlord of basically all of Anatolia, and even capable of trying for the title of Great Sultan of the West, were now definitively over. However, within this reduced territory, the authority of the Sultan in Konya was actually quite strong, perhaps even stronger than it had been in the days of Kılıç Arslan. In Konya, a real state-building project had commenced under Mesud's rule. During the days of Danishmend overlordship, Emir Gazi had very helpfully killed off any potential rival to his son-in-law. Now he of course did this for his own reasons. Those other Seljuk princes were his own enemies. But it had the side effect of securing Mesud on the throne, and it allowed the state to coalesce around the Sultan. Now this of course had precedents. In particular, back in Iznik, Mesud's grandfather Suleiman had taken over the Roman apparatus of the province from the top down. And this is again happening here in Konya. The local Byzantine elites remained on and became integrated into the Sultanate, bringing with them the continuing infrastructure of the Roman state. But there were new additions as well. The importation of the court structures of the Great Seljuk Empire, the viziers and the other officials, the divans, the cadis, and the Islamic judiciary, and so on. This, of course, had begun before the reign of Mesud, but as the Sultanate settled into Konya, this proper Perso-Islamic state structure really began to cement itself. We can see evidence of this in the archaeological record. We know that it was in 1130, at the very latest, that Mesud began construction of what would come to be the Al-Eddin Mosque in Konya, the greatest mosque of the city and one of the most historic mosques in all of Turkey. Sitting on a hill in the very center of Konya, now called the Al-Eddin Hill, the Al-Eddin Mosque would be continually added to over the course of the next century, and would house many of the tombs of the Sultans of Rum. Indeed, some archaeological evidence indicates that Mesud began initial construction on the mosque complex as early as 1120, that is, a mere 4 years after becoming sultan. Unlike the immediately recognizable Ottoman mosques, with their soaring domes inspired by the Hagia Sophia and the graceful, pencil-thin minarets, the Al-Eddin Mosque would be built in a much older, much more Anatolian style. Low to the ground, with a plain facade and a roof supported by a forest of columns, the mosque appears much more humble than the later imposing and imperial Ottoman mosques. Its most immediately striking features are, in fact, the tombs of the sultans built within the mosque complex. The building of a mosque on the summit of the hill occupying the very center of the city was, of course, a political statement, and deeply tied to Mesud's state-building project. Centering Islam as a cornerstone of his state, and making Konya start to look like a city that one would expect in the Muslim world, a city with a great mosque. Because, as we will discuss in a later non-narrative episode, we must remember that Anatolia was, at this time, overwhelmingly Christian. And earlier, back in Iznik, it was only during the reign of Kılıç Arslan that large numbers of Turks moved into the city and one of the churches had been converted into a mosque. This creation of a mosque from scratch in the center of the city of Konya was therefore something of a break with the Sultanate's prior practice. The mosque as the center of the capital, despite the fact that the population of the capital was still overwhelmingly Christian and Greek or Armenian speaking. We don't know if Mesud also built any medreses. Medreses or madrasas are schools of Islamic learning, and in the future it will be the medreses and the missionaries, scholars, imams, qadis, and jurists that they will produce that will really drive a lot of the mass conversion to Islam among the Anatolian peoples. Coupled with roving Sufi mystics and the corresponding proliferation of their turbes, that is, the tombs of Sufi pirs and sheikhs, this would become the route through which Anatolia will become Turkish and Muslim over the coming centuries. The grandest and most famous of these turbes is, of course, the great turbe of Mevlana Celal ad-Din Rumi in Konya, who we will cover in depth when the time comes. But while Mesud may very well have started medrese construction, the only extant medreses really date from about a century later, under the reign of Qaykubad the Great. Therefore, we cannot say that there is any evidence of medrese construction this early. However, it is likely that the processes that would lead to the mass conversion of the Anatolians to Islam were already beginning. The preaching of wandering Sufi mystics and, in Konya and the other cities where the great beys ruled, the beginning of elite conversion. It also seems likely that Mesud built something of a royal palace on the north side of the Al-Eddin Hill in the center of Konya. Right next to the Al-Eddin Mosque complex, just down the hill from the summit, there today stands a very small remnant of an early Seljuk palace. Now, the only part of it that remains today appears to date from the reign of Mesud's son, Kılıç Arslan II, based on an inscription that was discovered. However, it is possible that Kılıç Arslan II may have built this remaining part of the palace as an expansion or a replacement for an original palace built by Mesud in the same place. Regardless, based on the written sources, it seems likely that Mesud did engage in some sort of palace building. If you'll recall from our prior episode, both Emperor John's brother Isaac and Isaac's son John, aka Nephew John, had fled to Konya after falling out with the emperor. Nephew John had even converted to Islam and married Mesud's daughter. This of course points to the continued importance of Mesud even during the years of vassalage to the Danishmends. But it also implies that Mesud must have been able to host his Byzantine guests in appropriate style. Nothing like the sumptuous and ancient palaces of Constantinople overlooking the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, of course. And I'm sure that Isaac and nephew John saw their years in Konya as roughing it. But nevertheless, Mesud must have been able to host these men in something approaching royal dignity, meaning he must have had some sort of royal palace and converted or renovated local mansions. And the building or creation of such a palace and other residences was of course a key part of building the state. This was intimately connected to both the ongoing sedentarization of the Turks, or at least a large portion of them, and the early stages of Turkification. While the tribes remained in large parts of Anatolia, in particular the grasslands between the cities, the uplands of the Armenian highlands, and the mountains and valleys of western Anatolia, this was not the primary way that Anatolia became Turkish in the end. Genetic studies of modern-day Anatolian Turks reveal that the Central Asian genetic contribution is roughly 5 to 15% for most Anatolian Turks, with a median somewhere just south of 10%. Now, some people do have higher percentages, up to 30% in extreme cases. So not nothing, but a distinct minority contribution. And indeed, it is quite common to find Anatolian Turks with absolutely no Central Asian genetic ancestry. This is because Anatolia, fundamentally, did not become Turkish due to mass migration of the tribes. Instead, the local Anatolian peoples became Turks. They adopted the language and the religion of the nomadic conquerors, while a new Anatolian Turkish culture sprang into being, drawing upon local Anatolian cultures of the Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, and others, with some cultural roots going all the way back to the misty past of Anatolia. This also combined with nomadic Turkish culture and the broader culture of the Muslim world. Now, we are going to dive in depth into this in a later non-narrative episode, but the result was that Anatolia became something of a unique frontier culture, very distinct from the lands of the Byzantine Empire, but also from the culture of the Arab, Persian, and Central Asian worlds that the Turks had come from. And a key driver of this was the urbanization and sedentarization of many of the Turks. These Turks, unlike their brethren who continued to live the nomadic life, moved into the cities. As we discussed earlier, this began decades ago, right after Manzikert indeed. The Turks coming into the cities, partnering with the local elites, and stepping into the role vacated by the now gone Roman soldiers and mercenaries. Well, this has now been continuing for decades, and in the cities, a distinct Turkish urban world was emerging. And it would be this urban world that would ultimately be the engine driving Turkification. And we see it really coming into focus here, with the mosque building, the palace building, and the emergence of the settled courts. The Turkish future of Anatolia was being created here. However, at the same time, we should not forget that the tribes remained. And as the court in Konya became more settled, more cooked, the same thing happened in Anatolia that happened in the Great Seljuk Empire. The ever-present tension between the court and the wild tribes continued. Indeed, as always, we should remember that there was always a limit on the ability of the Sultan to actually control the tribes. Whatever treaties sultans might sign with Roman emperors, the fact was that the tribes were kind of going to do what the tribes always did: roam the land with their herds and raid any settled people that they thought were weaker than them. And this tension, this divide, isn't going anywhere. So this was the nature of the Sultanate in Konya at this time. Compared to the other Turkish beyliks of Anatolia, it was large and mighty. But compared to the Roman Empire, or the Great Seljuk Empire, or even the heights of the Sultanate of Rum under Suleiman and Kılıç Arslan I, it was really nothing to write home about. But the foundations of the Sultanate had been laid well. The seeds had been well planted. And now Mesud would begin to expand the Sultanate's power and authority again, to make the Sultanate not just the leading state of Turkish Anatolia, but the overlord, the suzerain of the whole land. Mesud appears to have started doing this basically immediately upon hearing of the news of the death of King Muhammad. Indeed, the Islamic histories imply that he conquered the lands of the Danishmend Beylik basically immediately. Ibn al-Athir says, Muhammad ibn Danishmend, the ruler of Malatya and the Marches, died this year. His lands were conquered by Mesud ibn Kılıç Arslan, the ruler of Konya and one of the Seljuks of Rum. But that is an extreme oversimplification. As we discussed last time, upon Muhammad's death, his son Melik Zunun claimed the throne in Kayseri, but this was immediately contested, and in Sivas, Muhammad's half-brother Ya'ub Hasan quickly married Muhammad's widow and claimed the throne for himself. So now there are two Danishmend Beys. Meanwhile, two of Muhammad's other sons, Ayn al-Dawla and Yunus, revolted in southeastern Anatolia. Yunus took the city of Masara, while Ayn al-Dawla returned from his stay with the Latins in Edessa and, allying with Yunus, began marching on the great city of Malatya, now under the suzerainty of Ya'ub Hasan in Sivas. Feeling that he could not afford to lose Malatya, which, remember, was perhaps the most critical city in southern Anatolia, in 1142 or early 1143, Ya'ub Hasan broke off a force of 2,000 men to defend the city. But this turned out to be a catastrophe. Bar Hebreus relates, Then the Turks who were therein rebelled, and they smashed the gate of the city, which was called Buridya, with axes, because the governor would not allow them to go out. And they sallied out, and put to flight those 2,000 men, and on that day they sent and brought al-Dawla, and made him ruler of Malatya. Thus Ayn al-Dawla seized Malatya sometime in 1142 or 1143, while in Sivas, Ya'ub Hasan was greatly weakened. And it was here that Mesud spied his chance. Allying with the late king's son, Melik Zunun in Kayseri, Mesud set out to rip apart the domains of the Danishmend Beys, namely northern Anatolia. In 1143, together with the forces of Melik Zunun, Mesud launched a great invasion and assault on Ya'ub Hasan's very capital at Sivas. Bar Hebreus says, Sultan Mesud of Iconium came against Sebastea, and he captured and destroyed it. However, this seems to be an exaggeration, and it does not seem that Sivas was totally destroyed. Indeed, it seems that after suffering a grievous defeat in Sivas and the sack of the city, Ya'ub Hasan was forced to flee to the Danishmend strongholds of Çankırı and Ankara. Mesud entered Sivas, and was now the overlord of the city that, decades earlier, he had fled to as a young man, and in which he had lived as a vassal and son-in-law of Emir Ghazi. But Mesud was not done. With Ya'ub Hasan in flight, he then turned against another of the heirs to the dead king of the north. After negotiating with Ayn al-Dawla through his wife, who Mesud apparently knew from his time in the court of Emir Ghazi, Mesud attempted to get the son of Muhammad to submit to him, or at least ally with him. But when negotiations went nowhere, Mesud gathered up his army and, marching quickly south from Sivas, led them to the great city of Malatya, where Ayn al-Dawla was happily sitting in his recently conquered prize. Bar-Hebreus says that the armies of the Sultan encamped outside the walls of the great city in 1143 and began setting up their great siege engines. This naturally terrified the population and forced Ayn al-Dawla to impose crippling taxes. However, after besieging the city all summer, in September of 1143, Mesud decided that he simply couldn't risk an assault. Likely, he had been hoping to come to a deal with Ayn al-Dawla while camped before the walls, or had hoped that the city would expel the newly arrived Danishmend Bey and surrender. But when that didn't happen, Mesud just decided that he had to go home. And so one day in September, the population of Malatya woke up to see that during the night, the Sultan of Rum had abandoned the siege and ordered the siege engines to be burned at dawn. Bar-Hebreus says that this took place on the day of the Feast of the Cross, and the local population, who again were mostly Christian, were relieved. It was also now, at the very latest, that Melik Zunun in Kayseri was forced to bend the knee. Indeed, according to some sources, he had even been forced earlier to flee to Konya to take refuge with Sultan Mesud himself. And so Mesud was finally able to reverse the roles. He had started his career as a vassal of the Danishmend Bey, and now it was the Danishmend Bey, or at least a Danishmend Bey, who was his vassal. With Malatya outside of his ability to control, at least for now, Mesud turned back to concentrate on his original enemy, Yağbasan, now holed up in either Ankara or the great fortress city of Çankırı. In a little attested-to campaign, likely in 1144, Mesud wrapped up his consolidation of power in central Anatolia. He marched his army to the north and wrested from Yağbasan both Ankara and Çankırı, permanently ending Danishmend rule over this region of Anatolia. Yağbasan himself was forced to submit, though his deep enmity to Mesud remained. He would soon be back in Sivas, trying to consolidate control over what remained of the Beylik, and plotting against the Sultan of Rum. So after a string of more or less constant victories, with the key exception of Malatya, by late 1144 or early 1145, Mesud had basically become the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. In some senses, this was a shocking turn of events after the death of King Muhammad just a couple years earlier. But on another level, there's nothing shocking about this at all. Mesud was a prince of the House of Seljuk, a status that gave him unique legitimacy among the Turks. Then his main rival, the Danishmend Beylik, fell apart, leaving his rejuvenated sultanate in Konya as the greatest power in Turkish Anatolia. And what followed is basically what you would expect. However, this still took generalship and diplomacy and strategy and skill, and I think we should credit Mesud for that. By 1145, the Sultanate had expanded from controlling a pocket of land around Konya to controlling all of central Anatolia from the mountains of the south along the Mediterranean up to Ankara, Çankırı, and the mountains of the north bordering the Black Sea. It now spread east to control Sivas and Amasya, and in Kayseri, the son of King Muhammad, Melik Zunun, had been forced to bend the knee to the Sultan of Rum. Indeed, it seems that the only great cities of Turkish Anatolia outside of the Sultan's control were Malatya under Ayn al-Dawla and the other cities of the east, such as Erzurum under the Selçukids, Erzincan under the Mengucikids, and the cities of the southeast under Artukid control. The Sultanate's power, at least in central and northern Anatolia, had been largely restored in like 1 or 2 campaign seasons after decades of Danishmend rule. The Sultan of Rum was back. And now that he was the overlord of most of Turkish Anatolia, Mesud of course began to do the classic thing for a new Turkish leader: begin raiding again the territories of the neighboring empire. This renewal of large-scale Turkish raiding to the west came at an inflection point in Roman history, because in April 1143, a new emperor had come to power in Constantinople, Manuel Komnenos, called Porphyrogenitos, or born in the purple, because he was the son of Emperor John. And it will be under Manuel Komnenos that the resurrection of the Roman Empire under the Komnenian dynasty will reach its apogee in many ways. Manuel had come to power after the death of his father, Emperor John. See, after hearing of the news of the death of Muhammad, the King of the North, and the subsequent collapse of the Danishmend Beylik, John decided that he could again afford to return to his campaigns in Cilicia. It had been Turkish raiding that had pulled him away from his attempts to dominate Armenian Cilicia and take on the Crusaders, which he still saw as absolutely critical. With the King of the North dead, and the Turks fighting among each other, now was as good a time as any to return to that mission. So in 1142, as Mesud campaigned across Anatolia, the emperor departed for the Levant, and he let it be known that he intended to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And he just so happened to be bringing with him on this pilgrimage a massive Byzantine army. This naturally made the Crusaders extremely angry and dubious about the pious intentions of the emperor. Once in the Levant, the emperor marched on the Crusader city of Antioch. If you'll recall, Antioch had been the first real major city to fall to the Crusaders, and the Byzantines had always maintained that it was rightfully a possession of Byzantium. As the emperor marched across northern Syria, he forced the last Count of Edessa, Jocelyn II, to hand over hostages to him. The emperor then campaigned against the various emirs and beys of the region, forcing several to submit, but without much help from any of the Crusaders. Furious with the Crusaders, and ready to reclaim what he always believed to be a part of the empire, John then turned his army against Antioch. The Crusaders in the city were soon besieged by the Roman emperor, and it appears that he even took the outer walls. But Jocelyn managed to instigate a riot within the city, forcing Emperor John to withdraw. Now John was put on the back foot, but he was still determined to force the Crusader lords of the Levant to submit to Constantinople. And given the disarray of the Crusaders, he actually had a good shot at that, up until he accidentally cut himself with a poisoned arrow while preparing for a second attempt on Antioch. The Emperor of the Romans died in agony several days later on April 8, 1143. With the emperor dead, the troops in Cilicia acclaimed his son, Manuel Komnenos, as emperor. And Manuel Komnenos is going to go down as a pretty solid emperor, not quite on the same level as his grandfather Alexios, but honestly, who could live up to that? Manuel will be with us for several episodes to come, and as we will see, will both inflict defeats on the Turks and be defeated himself, in particular at Myriokephalon, the site of one of the greatest victories in Turkish history. But for now, Manuel Komnenos knew that there was now no question of continuing the campaign in the Levant against the Crusaders. He needed to return to Constantinople to secure the throne, and to make sure that his uncle Isaac did not seize power. Isaac had of course earlier betrayed the empire and sheltered with Mesud in Konya, and his own son John was now currently in Konya, having converted to Islam and married Mesud's daughter. Manuel therefore sent ahead the Turkish Roman general John Aksu to Constantinople to imprison his uncle, as he himself gathered up the armies and returned. Aksu raced ahead and with his customary efficiency apprehended Isaac and locked him away in a palace and made sure that the capital was in hand for Manuel. Now this was not the end of Byzantine presence in the Levant, and in 1144, Raymond, the Prince of Antioch, demanded that Manuel cede Cilicia to him, basically taking advantage of the fact that the emperor had been forced to race back to Constantinople. This caused Manuel to assemble a fleet and an army to protect these territories from the Crusaders in the Levant. Incidentally, one of the commanders was a Roman Turkish general named Borsuk. But for now at least, the attentions of the emperor and the bulk of his forces would have to be in Constantinople, the Balkans, and Anatolia to secure his young regime. Therefore, in 1144, both the Byzantines and the Turks were in some sense under new rulers. Mesud had been on the throne for decades at this point, of course, but it was really only now that he'd become the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. And on the Roman side, the young Manuel Komnenos had only just now donned the purple. Unsurprisingly, therefore, Constantinople and Konya quickly came into conflict. Indeed, Mesud had already begun sending large raiding parties to the west for over a year at this point. And this resumption of large-scale raiding directed by the Sultan was, of course, merely a supplement to the sort of ever-present small-scale raiding by the tribes. Niketas Choniates even says that in May 1143, that is just a month after Manuel became emperor, one large raid managed to capture members of the Komnenian house. It was at this time that Andronikos Komnenos, Manuel's cousin on his father's side, he later reigned as tyrant over the Romans, and Theodore Dasiotes, who was married to Maria, the daughter of Manuel's brother, the Sebastocrator Andronikos, were captured by the Turks and taken to Mesud, who was then ruler of Iconium. While hunting wild game, they turned off the road taken by the army and, unaware, fell into the hands of the enemy. Stalking game, they themselves fell prey to the hunters of men. So as the intensity of Turkish raiding in Anatolia began to increase again, Manuel made it back to Constantinople. After confirming that his uncle Isaac was not going to be a threat, Manuel immediately began to prepare for war with the Turks. Mesud himself led a great raiding party to northwest Anatolia, and was raiding a fertile valley just to the east of Iznik named Melangea by the Greeks or Pamukova by the Turks. If you ever take the high-speed train from Istanbul to Ankara today, this valley is the rather picturesque valley you pass through immediately after entering the mountains. Emperor Manuel marched an army into the valley, scaring the Turks off, before setting up garrisons and marching back to Constantinople. But this was not the end of it, because a year or so later, in 1146, when he felt more secure on the throne, Manuel set out in another campaign against the Sultan of Rum. Assembling a massive army, the emperor set out south down the Aegean coast and into western Anatolia, passing Sardis, once upon a time the capital of the kingdom of Lydia and the Lydian satrapy of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire. On his march, he attempted to reassure the locals of the might of the empire, and refortify and garrison the region. Then the emperor marched his army east, up the great Meander River. For millennia, the Meander River and its valley has been the best route from the Aegean coast to the center of Anatolia, and great highways had been built up this broad and fertile valley by the Hittites, the kings of Lydia, the Persian satraps, the Hellenistic kings, and the Romans. And indeed, in the future, Manuel will march another army through this very valley, one that will meet its end at the hands of the Turks at a place called Myriokephalon. But we'll get there eventually. Once on the plateau, John Kinnamos tells us that the young emperor dispatched a letter to Sultan Mesud, informing him of the reason for the invasion. That is, the supposed encroachments on Roman territory and Mesud's conquest of the Danishmends. The letter told him to either submit or prepare for war. Mesud reportedly wrote back saying, "We have received your letter, mighty emperor, and we have prepared as you commanded. Then you should order your advance, not delay us by lengthy communications. The rest, as to how matters go, will be God's concern. and hours. Mesud then moved his army up to Akshehir, setting up for a showdown with the emperor. This city was where Manuel's grandfather Alexios had famously turned back, and was now the westernmost city in the Sultanate. The first major engagement, however, occurred as the Roman army marched towards Akshehir. Somewhere around Afyon, Mesud ordered his army out and engaged the Byzantines. However, it doesn't seem to have gone particularly well. John Kinemos tells us that the Turkish army suffered a severe defeat, and that a particular renowned Turkish warrior named Hayri was killed. After being defeated outside of Afyon, Mesud determined that he could not really hope to stop the Byzantines from reaching Akshehir, and so he withdrew the bulk of his field army back to the east, leaving Akshehir to be defended by the local garrison. Hopefully, the Byzantines would just take that city and then go home. Thus, the Byzantines were able to march up to the walls of Akshehir and put it to siege. Yet even without a field army to provide backup, and facing down a massive Roman army, the garrison in Akshehir resisted, and the siege became increasingly brutal. However, the garrison inside was simply not able to resist the massive Roman army, and eventually the city fell, no doubt becoming the scene of mass butchery, rape, and looting, as was standard in the Middle Ages. John Kinemos does tell us that the local Greeks, unhappy with rule by the Turks, joined the army, but this was by no means all of the population. But though the Romans had just taken Akshehir, the commanders of the army were unsure about what to do next. Apparently, the Byzantine generals tried to convince the emperor to turn back home, but Manuel was having none of it. Niketas Choniates tells us, Manuel, who appeared awesome and daring to the enemy, and more venturesome than his father John, did not choose to turn back, nor would he be persuaded by those who counseled him to consider returning home lest the Turks, in desperation, regroup and batter his forces. Instead, the emperor gathered together his generals and announced that the Roman army was going to march on Konya itself. Now, given that Manuel is later going to try to take Konya again in a campaign that will end disastrously for Byzantium at Myriokephalon, many historians think that even now, at the beginning of his reign, he was dreaming of driving the Turks out of Konya and out of Anatolia forever. But that is not certain, and it is entirely possible that this was not really a serious attempt by Manuel to take the city. Indeed, as the Byzantine commanders seem to have known, taking the city was likely impossible, let alone driving the Turks out of Anatolia. Instead, this may well have been intended to be more of a show of force, a way to show the Roman Sultan that the new emperor of the Romans was not someone you could push around. And it was also a way to show the Latins in the Crusader states of Outremer and back in Western Europe that, despite their views of the Byzantines, he was a holy warrior who would and could take the fight to the Muslims. A way to demonstrate that the Byzantines were not the devious infidel lovers that the Latins believed them to be, and also a sign that the Roman Empire was still a mighty state that they should not try to meddle with themselves. Just as new sultans wielded the sword of jihad to enhance their legitimacy, so too did Christian rulers take up the cross of the crusade for the same reasons. And so the Roman army marched out of Akshehir along the road to Konya. Again, Mesud assembled his forces to oppose him, and yet again the Turks were overcome. The armies met at a place John Kinemos says that the Turks called Andrakhman, likely somewhere near the small town of Ilgin, about 40 kilometers northwest of Konya. Kinemos says that the Turkish army was routed and fled back to Konya. However, Mesud appears to have not wanted to let the Romans continue the march to the city completely unopposed. See, there's actually a mountain range between Ilgun and Konya, and these passes would still have to be traversed by the Romans, unless they wanted to march around them and approach Konya from the northeast, a detour that would add about 60 to 70 kilometers to their march, and even that route would involve passing through some hilly terrain. So Mesud split up his armies. One portion he kept in Konya to prepare for the coming siege, which now seemed inevitable. But the other portion he detached and sent to the mountain passes guarding the city. This field army he split into two halves. One he sent to guard the hills around the capital, the other he himself took to the mountain passes to the west. As the imperial army came through the passes, they naturally encountered the Turkish army led by Mesud. According to John Kinamos, the emperor had advanced through the passes and come to a place called Kabala, almost certainly the mountain just to the west of Konya called Takalıdağ today. Relying on the fortifications and the mountains themselves, Mesud positioned himself on the right wing and launched an assault on the Byzantine army. However, demonstrating again the personal courage for which he was well known, Manuel Komnenos rallied his troops and himself led a counterattack directly at Mesud's right wing. This stabilized the Byzantine line, and the imperial army again began advancing. Mesud, reportedly stunned at the personal bravery of the emperor, ordered a retreat, though of course we should always take imperial historians with a grain of salt, particularly when they are describing the battlefield exploits of emperors who they happen to like. However, I think we're all pretty prepared to hear what happened next, as the imperial army rushed forward to pursue their enemy. Naturally, they were led into, you guessed it, an ambush. The feigned retreat, as always, was the bread and butter of Turkish tactics. The garrison of Konya sallied out of the city and joined the Turkish army that had been positioned in the hills around Konya. They then sprang forward and assaulted the Byzantines from the rear. Classic feigned retreat stuff. But Manuel Komnenos was actually a pretty decent general, and seeing the rear of his army succumb to a Turkish ambush, he stopped his advance and pursuit of Mesud. He then regrouped his forces in the front. Turning around, he then rushed back, leading a charge that stopped the ambushing Turkish army in the rear. This piece of honestly pretty damn good generalship may well have forestalled the destruction of a large part of his army. As we have seen over and over before, the Turks are pretty good at laying ambushes in mountain passes. As night fell then, Mesud was forced to pull his men back into the city of Konya. The attempt to stop the enemy from reaching the walls of the capital had failed. But at the same time, as the emperor pulled his army up to the walls of the capital of the Sultanate of Rum, and even rode around it, he must have known that there was no way he could take it. His army had no doubt taken some pretty serious losses in the march to get here, and now the Sultan had stationed his men along the great walls of Konya, no doubt well provisioned inside. The Roman generals had all told him not to come here for a reason. The city simply could not be taken. Yet still, the emperor ordered the Byzantine army to put Konya to siege. The imperial army spread out and more or less encircled the walls. In an interesting anecdote, according to Choniates, while Konya was besieged, the Byzantine army even saw the wife of Isaac's son John, now a Muslim, on the walls of the city. Choniates tells us that she peered out from above the walls and delivered a persuasive defense on behalf of her father, the Sultan. However, this siege just was not going to succeed. Not only were Konya's defenses formidable, but the Roman army was deep in Turkish territory, and Mesud had further forces that he could summon. Tellingly, John Kinamos writes that when the imperial army besieged Konya, Mesud summoned Turks from the east to aid him, writing, very numerous forces of the Turks, who dwell far beyond Iconium, where the late Ibn Danishmend used to rule, arrived in alliance with the Sultan and joined him. This is a clear sign that Mesud had consolidated control over many of the smaller bays to his east, that he really was the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. And there was just no way that the imperial army, deep behind enemy lines and weakened, was going to be able to oppose this force. So after allowing his men to pillage the environs of Konya, violate some Turkish graves, and fire what were basically some symbolic arrows against the battlements, the emperor turned around and marched back to Byzantine territory. But even though his army was unable to take Konya, the point had still been made. Even marching this far into the territory of the Sultanate was a great accomplishment. Remember, Shahan Shah had stopped the great Alexios from even reaching the city in 1116. And the new emperor no doubt rose in the estimation of Sultan Mesud and the Turkish beys. So sitting there in 1146, it sort of looked like the Sultanate of Rum and the Roman Empire were destined to march further down the road of war. I mean, the Sultan just has to respond to this invasion, right? You can't march a Roman army to the gates of Konya and then have nothing happen. Mesud just has to retaliate, especially given how fresh his rule as the actual overlord of Turkish Anatolia actually was. What would the other beys start whispering to each other if the new master of Anatolia just sat there and took this? But things just didn't turn out that way, because the year 1144 had actually been a truly momentous year. Not only was Manuel Komnenos newly on the throne, and Mesud wrap up his conquest of Anatolia, but even greater events had unfolded in the Levant. Because it was in December 1144 that the Atabey of Mosul, the great Muslim conqueror Imad al-Din Zengi, marched his army to Edessa itself. This was the seat of the county of Edessa, one of the largest of the Crusader states and the first to be founded. For years, though, the county had been placed under increasing pressure by the Muslims. First Belek Ghazi, Emir Ghazi, and King Muhammad, but then finally Imad al-Din Zengi. Zengi consolidated Muslim control of the region of northern Syria around Edessa, strangling the county before marching in to deliver the killing blow. Ibn al-Athir relates, he invested the city and for 28 days attacked, carrying out several assaults. He sent the sappers forward, who mined the city wall. He maintained a constant attack, for fear that the Franks would gather, march against him, and rescue the city. The curtain wall, which the sappers had mined, fell, and the city was taken by force of arms. He besieged the citadel, and took that too. Edessa thus fell to Imad al-Din Zengi on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1144. After nearly 50 years of Christian rule, Edessa, modern-day Urfa, had been retaken by the Muslims. The county of Edessa was reduced to an untenable strip of land hugging the east coast of the river Euphrates. The fall of Edessa caused a sensation in both the Muslim and Christian worlds. Later Muslim historians would point to it as the glorious start of the reconquest of the Levant, the commencement of the great jihad that would drive the Latin infidels back to whence they had come, the beginning of the Holy War that led to the victories of Saladin and the redemption of the Holy Land. And in Western Europe, the news of the fall of Edessa was shocking. The first Crusader state of Outremer had been dealt a mortal blow. The great city of Edessa was lost, and the county itself was now clearly on its deathbed, unless aid could be sent from the West. God was clearly furious with the sins of the Christians, and the faithful therefore had to be called back to the true path, and vengeance had to be meted out to the Muslim heretics. So next time, a new crusading army will appear, determined to avenge the fall of Edessa and conquer again in the Middle East. And thus, in Constantinople and in Konya, the Roman emperor and the Roman sultan, instead of marching further down the road of war, will set aside their differences to face this new threat from the West together.